Hackney Diamonds. What an unwittingly perfect album title. I am referring, of course, to the new Rolling Stones album that was just recently released at the time that I'm recording this. There's a meme that I saw on Facebook where two cartoon characters are walking past a window with a sign in it saying "New Rolling Stones, New Beatles," and one of them's looking at the other and saying, "Wait, how much did we just turn our clocks back?" Which I thought was really funny and also really cool because with all this talk of whether our albums, cultural events, does anything move the needle anymore? Do people care about records? Well, apparently they care about a new Rolling Stones album. That is still something that is seismic enough to get people to notice. And I don't think it's fair to presume that this is just boomers or older listeners who are the only ones caring. You can go on TikTok and see evidence of younger people, millennials, Gen Zers, playing classic music and using it in their videos and stuff. There's a part of me, the louder part, the one that typically will steer with the hands on the steering wheel, that wouldn't have even listened to this album for a couple of reasons. I don't think the Rolling Stones can possibly be without drummer Charlie Watts, who recently passed away, obviously before the making of this record. The rhythmic thing between Keith Richards and Charlie Watts, the way they locked into a very particular kind of groove, like the way their rhythm moved forward and side to side, to me, is the Rolling Stones. It is the DNA strand. Like the two of them were so interwoven in what they did in their roles in this music, and that thread formed the backbone of the band's sound. So the first thing I'm thinking is like, how the hell do you even consider continuing and making a new record without this integral piece of your band? And so I was like, I'm not even going to listen to it. I'm not, just like I've never to this day, and I will not ever listen to the so-called last Black Sabbath album, 13. I will not listen to it. It's not worth it to me. You could put $10,000 on the table. Well, I don't know. Nobody's putting $10,000 on the table for me to put my money where my mouth is. So let me not quite go that far. But I would be nervous if you put $10,000 on the table that listening to this album would diminish my the place this band occupies for me. The Rolling Stones I'm not quite as attached to, but even still, I won't touch stuff like this typically. I will not touch the albums released under the name The Who when it's just two people. I'm not doing it. And I am someone who oftentimes if there's a band that I think one person is totally essential, I won't go see them when that person leaves. I mean, I'll relax it at times, or I'll go out of curiosity. But if someone handed me a free ticket to see the Rolling Stones, again, I'm not so attached to them that seeing them live, the risk reward is not so daunting that it's like, oh, I might enjoy it anyway. Now, I'm glad I listened to this album because it proved to me that these guys still have a spark left that should be shared with the world, even though I don't like the album. Even though I think it's an unfortunate missed opportunity. There's another side of me, not as loud, more reasonable, more tempered, that says, look, where in spite of all my resistance, in spite of like, oh, why are these guys doing it? They don't need to do this. They don't need to keep coming out here and taking, a chink off their legacy every time. There's another part of me that just feels reassured and glad. It's like, oh, Grandpa Mick is back. And if you had grandparents who were Olympic swimmers or something in their day, you wouldn't tell your grandparents you can't go back to the pool because you were so great at this thing that you did. So don't ever do it again. Don't touch it. And that's kind of what I feel here. And the record opens with those very familiar Keith Richards types of riffs, guitar licks. But what you immediately notice is the absence of Charlie Watts. And not only is the absence glaring, but it's like they didn't even try to acknowledge that something vital is missing. Right? If they had brought somebody in with a lot of character, a drummer that has their own thing, as alien as it would sound, at least it would sound like something. These drums sound generic. There's no flavor to them. They're just straight. And after so many years of these guys pinning their entire sense of groove around this one person, how could you just do that? And yet there are flashes. I'll admit I only got to the fourth song, and I'm glad I listened to that one because the third song killed it. I was going to hit stop right there. I was like, all right, I've had enough. I listened to the fourth song. I will probably listen to this whole record. And I don't feel bad reviewing it, sharing my thoughts before then because it revealed itself very clearly for what its problems are. There are melodies, there are licks. I mean, there's moments where it's a little too referential to what they've already done. It doesn't feel fresh at all. It feels hackneyed. It feels like exhuming something long buried and trying to put I don't know, digging up a corpse, taking its clothes to the dry cleaners, and then putting the same clothes on the corpse. Like, why would you do that? And I understand there are listeners who just want something familiar and they're going to be fine with that no matter what. Oh, it sounds like the Rolling Stones. But that's like, we already have so much from this band. When you think about their body of work, right? If you take these big sort of titanic British rock bands, the Rolling Stones, the Who, the Beatles, why am I blanking on, Jesus Christ, why am I blanking on who else? Black Sabbath, Deep Purple, I would put those two bands up there too. Even though, if you sort of go by the sheer numbers, clearly you're going down one tier, but in terms of accomplishment and footprint on music, I would put those two bands in there as well. The Beatles, for me, left behind a legacy, and I'll get to their new song in a second. But their legacy is so magical, and there's so much to it. The Who were an incendiary live act, but the Rolling Stones, as far as I'm concerned, left behind an extraordinary payload of hit songs. Every now and again, it'll hit me. I'm like, oh yeah, that song, 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 that song. And I'm not big on hits being the determining factor for what a band's value and what a band's impact is. I tend to prefer entire albums which consist of deep cuts and hits and try to take them as a whole. But I have to say, if there is a band I would point to where you can put on like a greatest hits and be knocked the fuck out, it's the Rolling Stones. So in doing this, it's like, well, what is the goal here? This record is very polished, too polished. It's got commercial aspirations, and yet there are songs in here that if they had left them a little bit more scuffed up, would have been really cool. Mick Jagger's melodies They're slightly cracked, but still really spirited. It's like, man, let the leather show on their skin a little bit. Play into the fact that these are truly elder statesmen. you know, why polish this so much? There's a song on here. What is it called? There's a song on here, "Bite My Head Off," which I didn't even realize while I was listening. Paul McCartney's on the song, and it's just like, man, this was a fertile piece of music. There's shades of country in it, but they turned it into this like slick, generic power ballad. I would have preferred for this band to do something different, right? Like as I got further through this record, I'm like, man, if I saw these guys playing in a somewhat intimate venue, I know that would be ridiculous. They would never be able to fit themselves into something small scale. But if you heard people, especially them, playing these songs in a modest sized venue close by, even on the fucking deck of a restaurant or something, you'd be like, oh, yeah, that's a good time. That's pretty cool. There's a spunk here. There's still a spark. There's spirit here. And yet they just kind of poured all this gloss all over it. I don't get it. I don't get why. What was the thinking there? It's like, no, our faces are fucking look like leather. We're so aged. Let's do that. You have some really cool, subtle moments of Keith Richards and Ron Wood's guitars playing off of each other. Their signature tones. Ron Wood's nice and thin and sort of glittery. If you've heard the Rolling Stones, you're aware from a certain period. You're aware of what his tone sounds like, and obviously Keith Richards, and it's all sort of neutralized in this mix under this sheen. Very unfortunate, because it is reassuring, and I'm again mostly resistant to artists coming out at this late stage. Not because of ageism. It's not so much the age. It's that I think artists lose their inspiration at a certain point. It's particularly in this, for some reason I feel this way more about rock music, because chemistry between people is such a core component of seeing a rock band, right? Or at least as far as I'm concerned. And yet, had these guys sat on a porch somewhere and brought in some percussion players, or hung out with Carlos Santana, or like maybe, I don't know, had Bruce Springsteen produce the music, or Don Was, or Mike Campbell from Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers producing them. There is one track on here produced by Don Was. It's called "Live by the Sword." That was from a session. They started the album with Don Was, but then for a number of different reasons that stalled, and so they worked instead with this producer Andrew Watt, who's much more of a pop guy than Don Was. Or if they'd had Tom Bukovac guest on some songs, or help them arrange things or something, bring some new blood, or gone somewhere in Senegal and dealt with a completely different approach to rhythm and recording, and still done their thing, right? Still done those guitar licks with Mick Jagger's singing style with new elements. This could have been amazing. It really could have. It's like, wow, I was wrong. Johnny Ramone and I were both wrong. Even though I didn't technically agree with Johnny Ramone, but when he said, I've always thought there should be a mandatory retirement age in rock and roll. I don't literally think that's true. But I do think there's a point where you're kind of wearing out your welcome a little bit. And I was wrong. These guys are welcome in my, like, the more I think about it, I'm like, yeah, there's a new Rolling Stones. This is cool. This is like kind of neat. It's like going with your grandparents somewhere and realizing they still have a lot more energy than you gave them credit. And yet, it's like going on a vacation with your grandparents and yet realizing they decided to pack poorly for the trip and dress in like fucked up, embarrassing clothes. That's basically how I would sum up this record. I only got as far as the song Whole Wide World. So I heard Angry, Get Close, Depending on You. Actually, I heard 5 songs. Angry, Get Close, Depending on You, Bite My Head Off, which is the one with Paul McCartney, and Whole Wide World. I am both encouraged and disappointed by this album. There is an album in here somewhere, and it could have really come to life and come to light with different choices. I would have started with a different drummer or a different approach to drumming. I would have brought in other instrumentation that would like throw them off a little bit, but still like come at them from a different angle, but in a way that would ultimately lead to them finding themselves, landing again on what their essence is. And we're hearing some of the essence, but it's not properly captured. Those are my thoughts on this record. As far as Now and Then, the new Beatles tune, which I would put in quotes because I was wanting not to like this song. I was ready to dismiss it along the same lines, and in spite of my best efforts, it won me over. You know, again, the louder part of me is like, okay, this isn't really a Beatles song. This is a Frankenstein. You've got raw material from a demo tape that John Lennon recorded in his Dakota apartment in Manhattan in 1977. This was not intended to be a Beatles song. This was one of his ideas. Then you had George Harrison's guitar tracks from 1994. And then you have Paul McCartney and Ringo adding their touches, with Giles Martin adding his. Giles being George Martin's son, who has very much followed in his father's footsteps and has done a lot of work on the Beatles catalog and came up with the orchestrations for this. So, of course, my alarms went off when I read a headline, "The Beatles release a song assisted by AI." But this is actually a form of artificial intelligence that's really helped. There are new advances in machine learning where if you take a track or a recording, it's like miraculous, the separation you can get. Like you can strip two things apart in a way that is truly mind-blowing. So John Lennon's demo, he played piano and sang into a cassette, and there were obvious issues when George Harrison was still alive. George and Ringo and Paul tried to work on this song at that time. It was just too difficult because they tried to make John's voice clearer and then the piano would sort of drown him out, which is a typical problem you have when you've got two things, you know, it's like fused together sonically and you can't do much with that. So when Peter Jackson did his whole Beatles series Get Back, he informed them, he's like, well, listen, you can do this now. You can do something with this cassette. So they were able to strip the vocal and the piano apart, and then Paul McCartney played the piano, which at first I was like, why would he do that? Why wouldn't he just leave the piano track that was there? Why wouldn't he add his own piano to John Lennon's piano so we could have two pianos? Wouldn't that be great? They didn't do that, and when you hear the original, you can see why. I'll link to the original. I'll link to the trailer, little mini documentary. It was sort of in rough shape. But the vocal, they were able to, most of it, build the song around that. And there's a moment in the mini doc where Paul McCartney says, I know that John would have, if we'd asked him, you know, do you want us to, the three of us, to finish one of your songs? I know the answer would have been yes. And I'm like, oh, I don't know about that. Yeah, you knew this guy as well as anybody, but something tells me now, if he were dead, as he is now, and you could ask him through a medium and channel his spirit, I'm sure the answer, I'm guessing, would be like, oh, yeah, go ahead and finish it, you know, with some sarcastic, humorous quip. You know, he'd give them his blessing. But if he were alive, would he have participated in this? I don't know. And there's commentary from Sean Ono Lennon, and they're selling this song as like, it's the final thing we'll ever hear from the Beatles. And, you know, it's like, isn't it wonderful how the four of them are together on a track, and it's so magical. And it's like, well, as much as I want to poo-poo all that, I felt that it actually is. I was like, I was surprised that I didn't just shrug that off as like sentimentality. Largely in part due to the fact that you can hear George Harrison really well, and it's really funny because when I was thinking about how Paul McCartney played the piano, I was like, oh, that's sounds like Paul McCartney to replace someone else's part, because he did that in the Beatles. There was a few famous points where he did that. But also like the drumming, Ringo Starr's drums are so alive. And this truly does sound like a Beatles song. And the fact that the lyric just fortuitously works out and fits so perfectly with what this song is, which is looking at the now and the then. And it's a real poignant, surprisingly poignant cap on perhaps the most storied career in the history of music. So, I mean, really isn't much more you can ask for something for these guys to sort of stumble into something like this by mistake, essentially, and we get this. And I have long argued that having everything at our disposal and having our consciousness so aimed in this virtual realm has really left us with a widespread collective craving for a sense of being anchored in time, because when your nose is in your phone all the time, it's like life just whooshes by you in a blur and you don't feel anchored. And also having so much of the media we consume and interact with, being able to access that all on demand is awesome, but there isn't a sense of all of us adhering to the temporal flow. We're not all sort of doing that together. We're each sort of in our own digital hallway, going at warp speed through these bits and bytes. And so when the Rolling Stones and the Beatles do something, and you can feel this groundswell of discussion, of attention, of excitement, of genuine joy, that's meaningful. And I hope that we can continue to create that with some of the contemporary music we have, that we can find our way back to that, because clearly we're craving it. Clearly there's something missing that we're looking to revive. And, what better way to do it? I mean, in spite of my feelings on the new Rolling Stones, I'm kind of reassured that they're out there. And I never thought I would say something like that. Typically, I'm like, whatever. I'm rolling my eyes at things like this. It's like a sales pitch. It feels contrived. It's like, come on, will you guys hang it up already? That kind of thing. But I don't feel that here. Look, I hope the Rolling Stones make another record. I think it would be fantastic if they made an acoustic record or started from that basis. If they tried to do something intimate instead of huge, right? If they got away from the gigantism of their sense of we're this juggernaut and we're still kicking, I hope this isn't the last that we've heard of the Rolling Stones. So there you have it. Thanks for hanging with me to the end of this video. Hitting the like and subscribe button would be most appreciated, as would making a donation, which you can do via Venmo or Coffee. Links are in the show notes. You can also sign up for my Substack, which has both free and paid tiers. Mostly, I just appreciate you hanging out to the end of this video. For Feedback Def, I'm Sabby RK, the apostate. The apostate. I'm Sabby Reyes Kulkarni, the apostate music journalist. Over and out. This is, what's really gross is my hair sticking out like that.